Hey everybody, so welcome back to part 2 of Node.js Koa project with PostgreSQL. So in this episode what we're going to do is basically get our web server started. Where we got up to last time was we managed to have our application or program basically printing hello world whenever we started it. So what we're going to want to do this time is something a little bit more substantial and have an actual server powered by Koa up and running and basically keep the server alive and possibly be able to make some requests to it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is basically install some dependencies. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first one we're going to want to install is Koa itself. So let's give that a go now. So we're just installing it using npm. You can use yarn if you're interested in using yarn. I prefer npm just because I like to keep things as vanilla as possible, but yarn is perfectly acceptable. Okay, so we installed it. You can see everything reloaded. Let's clear this out and start again. Okay, you don't need to clear it out. I'm just doing that just because I wanted to make sure this was on our first load. Okay. So the next thing we're going to want to do is basically import Koa into our project. And that's it, easy as that. And then we're going to want to set up a new application. I recommend reading the Koa documentation to find out what's actually happening. But for the most part, this is basically initializing a new instance of Koa. And we probably want to add a root. We haven't got any routing added in at the moment, but what we'll do is just do a simple root. And let's do it, yeah, we'll leave it as a lambda, just because lambda expressions tend to be a little bit cleaner. And then what we'll do is, so we're going to move our hello world into this use function on the app, which is basically a simple root. And the next thing we're going to want to do is basically start this application in our start function. So first of all, we're going to use a try catch, and this is just so that we can catch any errors that may happen. I'm going to log them as well so we can see what happens in our logs. And we're going to start the server on port 3000. You can configure this if you want to. I tend to use 2000 as a nice consistent number, and it seemed to be recognized as the development server type ports that people use. So it's kind of a convention now. You can use it of whatever port you want, but I'm going to do port 3000, and let's give that a go. Okay, so you'll see here we haven't got any hello world this time. But what happens if we go curl localhost 3000? You'll see that we actually print out hello world. So what this is doing is when we're making a request using curl or curl, this function here gets called and it prints out hello world. So what else can we do? Let's see if we can get hello world returning. So this is our context. To give you more information, this CTX object. It stands for the context, basically. What we can do is we can actually log this context. So let's give that a go, so we can see what's happening there. So you'll see we basically get a request object, which is basically the actual raw request data that we want to get information from. We can see that it's a GET request. The URL was / which is basically the root, and you get the header information, which is the host, which was localhost. And the user agent as well, and also what it accepts as a request. And then we get the response already pre-populated, which is 404, because it's assumed that it's not found initially at the beginning, so we can change that. So let's give that a go. We also get the original node rec, original node res, and the socket, and that's just additional information that we don't actually need at this stage. What we care about is the request and the response, and also something called the body. So let's do ctx.body equals hello world. Let's give that a go. And there you have it. We are returning hello world back, which is pretty awesome. So that's it. Now, this isn't going to work for a fully featured web app or a web API. The issue is because we're not going to be able to, we can. It's going to get a little bit arduous if we're going to have to keep doing things like ctx dot or if ctx dot request dot URL equals slash hello root else ctx body equals hello. We can do this basically. So this is like a simple form of routing, but as I mentioned, it's going to get a little bit arduous, but we'll give it a go and see what happens. Okay. So we get hello root back. Let's do users hello / users. So there's sort of a slight indication of how routing is going to go about. But there is much better ways of doing routing, and we're going to take a look at them. Probably, yeah, we'll take a look at them now. So we're going to want to install a new dependency, and this is going to be called koa-router, aptly named. So we'll clear this off. And we'll install that. Hopefully you can see this well. If not, let me know in the comments and I'll make sure that I increase the size. For me, this is kind of the most perfect size because it gives me enough information on the screen, whilst hopefully you guys can see it properly. Okay, so we've installed the koa-router. Now, how do we use koa-router? So koa-router is kind of an interesting object. It basically acts very well. It acts in a really nice way if you've ever seen express routing or things like that, and it's kind of similar. So what we will do is we will move this into a project, its own folder later, but for the moment we're just going to put it here. So we go const router equals require koa-router, very similar to above, and we're going to want to instantiate a new object. So const router equals router. Now we don't use new in this one, and that's just the way that the library writer has created it. It's sometimes a little bit difficult. I recommend reading the documentations though about this, and then kind of figuring it out. Okay, cool. So we've got our router object. What can we do with it? Let's do router.get / and we can do a async ctx. In fact, we can remove the asynchronous. We don't need it for this route. And ctx.body equals hello. Okay, now if we try to run this, nothing will actually happen because we haven't set up to use it. We're still using the standard route. Now you'll instantly notice there's something different about this, which is router.get, whereas this is sort of app.use. You'll notice in the actual headers here we have the method, but with our original workings it actually doesn't care whether you use a post or a get, which isn't very good for an API. You kind of want to keep it RESTful and use gets for reading, posts for creating, and so on. So what the koa-router allows us to do is basically set the method type and the path, which is very, very useful and very extensible. So how do we use it? Let's go back to our app.use, and we're going to use it like any old piece of middleware. So we'll basically do app.use, and we can put a slash in here if we want to. It's probably the right thing to do because it is a standard path. And we'll do router. So you can see here it's thrown an error because router is not correct. So what we actually need to do is router.routes. And again, that has also thrown another error. So I think it's because I'm getting mixed up with the two routes, it's actually router.routes, that's it. So there is no pathing within the application context, it's only within the routes context. So this doesn't work, unfortunately. So instead we do this, app.use router.routes. So the router itself is handling all the paths. what we will probably want to do is version our API, and versioning is very useful in case you want to make breaking changes later on, so you don't affect any clients that are already running operating on an old API. And we'll sort of explain how that will work using the router later on. But so basically what we've got now is app.use and router.routes. So let's try it now. There we go. See, we've got our get route response returned. Let me shrink that back down. Sorry about that. Okay, now if we do the post, which we did before, you'll see we get a not found because post is not handled. We can handle it by doing router post ctx hello post route. Let's try it again. There we go. So that's basically how we can handle routing. So next thing we want to do is we want to do sort of more named routes. So currently we've just got router.get / to get our actual route or the route path, and we've got the post method as well. So let's have a look at getting, let's say, a user route. So we'll do router.get / users equals ctx, and we'll do ctx.body equals hello users. We will do something a little bit more than just helloing us back, but hello is a good way of sort of showing these routes and how they're working together. Okay, so you'll see here we've got hello / users. Now, this may be slightly cumbersome if we wanted to do this for the post one. And let's say the put route as well. As you can see, we're duplicating a lot of this work for creating our user routes. So we can actually do something a little bit easier. So we can actually nest our routers together in a different way. So let's give that a go. So what we can do is just do const users equals another router. So we're creating a new router for our user routes. And we can do this. So router.get. Let's even do the users. .get ctx and context.body equals hello users. Users.post equals create users, and we'll leave it like that for the moment. Now, in our actual main router object, we can do router.use / users and users.routes. Let's give that a go. And if we post, let's add that in. We got our create user routes. So what we can do here is basically nesting routes. We can easily create an extensible tree of what we want to, of sort of, our different objects and things like that. So it's a really nice way of reusing components without having to sort of rebuild everything. So what's next? Let's move this, and this is what I would normally do in a project, move this out into something a little bit more manageable. So I would create another directory called routing, which is probably a good name. You could also have it as routes, but it gets a little bit confusing with things that we're going to do later on. But routing is what I usually go for. Create a root index.js as usual, and we'll basically migrate this where it needs to go. So we'll import our router, and we'll have it as our base or our root router. And as we don't really have any other routers, we can just return this at the moment, but what we'll do instead is we'll put a router or root even, and we can do async ctx. The reason we would normally do async is just because we might have some asynchronous operations. We can technically remove it at this point, so it's not that bad an idea. But for consistency, let's keep it asynchronous. And we're also going to rename this router, I think. Root and router, it sounds like it might be a little bit confusing. And we can do module.exports equals router. So we'll basically export the router, not the roots, and we'll include that in our application. Now, this basic root path here, where we get a get request as just / and return a context status, this is kind of important because a lot of monitoring applications will basically ping your root path and make sure that they get a 200 status back to determine that the API or application is healthy. So we kind of want to keep that to that sort of tradition and make sure that we do it ourselves. Okay, cool. So we've now got this created, we've got our base roots set up, and we haven't got anything else to set up yet because we actually don't have any resources. So what's next? Let's go into our index.js. We can get rid of this stuff we've got here. We can do const roots, require routing. And let's just change this to roots.roots. Now let's rename it router. It looks a little bit confusing having roots.roots. And let's give it a go. Now if we just do a curl back to our base path, we get an OK, which is all we want. You can do a verbose and give it a go. Excellent. So that's basically it for routing. That's the basics of routing, and we've got our server up and running as well. So what we want to do next is probably start looking at adding some middleware whilst we've got our application running. So middleware is basically the koa-router is a middleware. It's a way of sort of handling requests before it going to its final destination and basically doing some additional stuff. You'll see that we don't have any information about these requests to our log. Nothing is displayed here, which is kind of not very great for debugging if you want to see that something else has happened. So what we're going to want to do is basically have a look at certain different properties that are going on, and the first one is probably the response time to see how long it actually takes, so we can sort of track down any requests that might be quite long. So let's install a new package from npm. We're going to call it koa response time. So let's save this, and we'll import it in as well. Now we've already used, let's call it response time. Require koa response time, and we'll get it capitalized. Now the way we use this is very similar to how we use our roots, but we want to use it before our roots because our root should pretty much be the last thing that occurs. We want sort of everything else to occur before then. So let's give it a go. We're going to use app.use, very similar to below, but this time we're just going to use response time, and we're going to call it as it's a function. Again, make sure you check out the documentation to see what's actually happening here. Now let's give it a go. And you'll see not much is happening, probably because I haven't set up anything that will allow us to display this. So if we basically check out the roots itself, so let's add a console.log here, you'll see that well, you probably won't see anything, which probably leads me on to the next piece of middleware we actually need, which is some logging. So this piece of middleware, if I just check the documentation very quickly, and I believe, let me load it up. I believe what it does is adds a piece of time to the, so it adds a piece of time to the response header, which basically is quite useful if we want to produce any sort of logging on that. Now let's do a V on that one. There we go. You can see it in X response time. So I was kind of hoping it would display here, but you can't really see it. But you can see it when we do a verbose login. So you can see that it came back in 2 milliseconds. So it's very good for the client to sort of determine why things are taking long. We can also capitalize that and display it if we want to. How do we display it? So we could just use our own piece of middleware, which will be like this, and we would just sort of display. So this is slightly different, and I will go further into this one. In this one, we're going to have an asynchronous function, and it's going to be next and context. And what we would do is do await next, and then ctx.response. Now, whether we can actually get a hold of this is quite an interesting. Let's see if we can. I'm not convinced we will be able to, but because I believe it comes after this, so we might need to put this one below. Let's do const time, and let's consider log. Let's see if anything actually comes about from this one. Okay, so nothing came out. Let's try headers. Yep, nothing came out. So let's just log the console instead. Let's see here if we get anything. Okay, so we do get X response time there. You can see as the 2 milliseconds. I probably need to check the documentation, which I will do now. There we go. You can see we got the 2 milliseconds down here. And we had to add it in sort of after, because if you think about how these things go, they're kind of a chain. So what the next is actually a function which calls the next piece of middleware along the chain. So we basically, this piece of middleware here, will unnamed middleware, but it's the middleware that we wrote, gets called first. Then we basically wait for the next function to call. Next gets called, which is this. They then in turn will call next, which goes down to our roots. And then once it comes back, once this await is finished, we basically move on to the next line, so we can then log out the response time. So that's sort of a brief introduction to middleware. The last piece of middleware we probably want to add is our logging middleware, which I kind of talked about earlier. And this is going to be something called koa-Morgan. If you've ever used Express, you'll know a piece of middleware called Morgan, which is slightly similar. So let's take a look at that. So we'll do npm I koa-Morgan, and we'll save this as well. And let's import it. So we can just import it as Morgan. And we will use it after the response time. It's probably the right place to go. Now what we want to do is we just want to add a combined here. And this will sort of, it basically adds a combined logger. If you check the documentation out for Morgan, it will give you a little bit more information about what we can do with it. Combined is absolutely fine, but we can set up like different streams or anything like that. So you can also write this to an access.log. Yeah, I've definitely recommend checking out the documentation for Morgan. There's an awful lot of things you can do with it, but the combined is absolutely fine. And I'll give you an example on what that does basically in a second. Let's give it a go now actually. So if we go to localhost, there you go. You can see that it gives us basically the IP address it originated from, which is which is the IPv6 of my local address. You can see the date and time that it came, what the method was, and the user agent, and also what the response. So it gives you really nice information about what's going on. Let's say we wanted to return an error status of 404, not found. You can see that it also gives us that as well. So it's a really nice way of seeing basically all the requests come in, and we can see everything sort of happening. We can also write this to basically be we can write this to a log file or anything like that. So we've got this later on to view. So I think combined is probably the most useful setup. You can also set up things such as common. Again, I recommend checking it out. You can also format your own sort of expression string. I tend to go with the common one. Combined, sorry, not common. Cool, so that sort of wraps up setting up our server and adding logging as well as response times to our requests. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thumbs up if you liked it, and please sub if you loved it. Yeah, we'll catch you on the next time.